Hello and good afternoon to all of you. I hope all of you are doing well and all of you are in good health. If you remember, in the previous class, we had discussed research in detail. We had discussed the role of variables in research. We had discussed different types of variables that may be participating in a research initiative. We have discussed the role of relationship in research. We have discussed the different types of relationship that may be established between the variables that are participating in the research. Then on, we discussed the inherent steps that are involved in a research process. And eventually, we concluded the class with an onion diagram that highlighted the different aspects of research or elements of research. In today's class, moving forward, we will try to understand the different aspects of research in greater detail. To begin with, let us try to understand what is research philosophy. Research philosophy basically refers to the very nature of research, which implies the way how the data sources are identified, the way how the data is collected from the data sources, the way how the data is analyzed, the way how the inferences of the analysis process is portrayed to meet the expectation of the research initiative. So, research philosophy tries to include in it these aspects of research. As we have learned in the previous class, there are 5 different types of research in philosophies. These are pragmatism, realism, positivism, postmodernism, and interpretivism. Let us start with pragmatism or pragmatic research philosophy. Pragmatic research philosophy is based on formation of concepts, hypotheses, theories, and their allied justifications. Pragmatic research philosophy considers ideology or idea to be true only if it is found applicable and satisfactory. This implies, in case of pragmatic research philosophy, ideologies or ideas are accepted only if they have practical application. Otherwise, they are rejected. Now let us move on to realism research philosophy. Realism research philosophy is based on assumption of scientific approaches to the conception and development of knowledge. Realism can be of two different types. These are direct realism and critical realism. Direct realism, which is also known as naive realism, can be expressed with the help of a phrase: what you see is what you get. In other words, in case of direct realism, we tend to create interpretation of the real world through personal human senses, which may be often biased, and in situation it may be deceptive. So it may not be applicable in real world. This is what is addressed to by critical realism. Critical realism, on the contrary, argues that humans do experience sensations and images of the real world which may be often deceptive and biased, which in case if used may create a wrong interpretation of the real world, leading to the failure of the entire research initiative. So it is very much important for us as a researcher to decide on what to rely, whether to rely on direct realism or to rely on critical realism. Now let us move on to positivism, or it's also called as positive research philosophy. In case of positivism research philosophy, there is an adherence or a strict adherence to factual knowledge. Factual knowledge is a knowledge that is acquired or obtained through observation, which is often considered trustworthy. So, in case of positivism research philosophy, we rely only on factual data. So, in this case, the role of researcher is restricted to only data collection and interpretation of data in certain objective ways. Now, let us move on to postmodernism. Postmodernism research philosophy relies on a holistic opinion of individuals and communities rather than depending on a predetermined rule for action. So, here, multiple opinions of individuals and communities are taken into account in order to draw certain research inferences. Let us move on to interpretivism. Interpretivism, which is also called as interpretivist, involves researchers to interpret the elements of study or elements of research after understanding it. Here, the role of researcher is not only restricted to interpretation, but it's also to understand the elements of research. So, it is important in case of interpretivism for a researcher to act as a social actor who is capable of appreciating the differences in the opinion of different people. So, depending on the requirement of a research initiative, you may rely on either of these five research philosophies, starting from pragmatism to realism to positivism to postmodernism and interpretivism. Now, let us move on to differences between inductive and deductive research. For ease of understanding, I have considered three important attributes of each of the research types for explanation. So these attributes are objective, approach, and limitation. Let us start with inductive research. Inductive research has an objective of developing a theory. Inductive research starts with observation, formulation of hypotheses, determination of relevant patterns, testing of hypotheses, followed by development of theory. The major limitation of inductive research is that in case of inductive research, conclusion can never be proven, but it can be validated or invalidated. Now let us move on to deductive research. Deductive research has an objective to test an existing theory. The approach that's adopted in case of deductive research is take an existing theory, formulate hypotheses, collect data, observe, and then eventually confirm. The limitation of deductive research is that the effectiveness of deductive research depends on the overall effectiveness of inductive research because it is the inductive research who develops the theories. Now let us move on to different types of research strategies. So depending on the requirement, you may pursue either of these research strategies. You may have experimental research, you may have survey research, you may have case study based research, you may have ethnographic research, you may have narrative research, you may have grounded theory research, you may have action research, and you may have archival research. Now let us go into each of these research types in greater detail. Now, experimental research is a research that has a strict adherence to scientific principles and design. Here, we have a controlled environment where the research is executed. For example, if you are developing a drug for an ailment, so first, what you do is you run the experiment in a controlled environment and then you see how the drug behaves, and eventually, if it is successful, you generalize it to the public. So, this is the approach that is adhered to in case of experimental research. So experimental research is based on formulation of hypotheses, identification of variables, formation of heuristics, and then manipulate the variables to feel or see the effects. In case of experimental research, everything is measured, calculated, and compared in order to generalize the result to the scientific domain. So these are the attributes of experimental research. Now let us move on to survey research. Survey research is a research wherein a researcher surveys or seeks for response from the respondents. Once the response is collected from the respondents, the response is statistically analyzed to draw certain meaningful research inferences. For an example, smart city projects. Depending on the opinion of the public, the smart city is planned, or the amenities of the smart city are planned. So, this is a typical example of survey research. Now, let us move on to case study based research. Case study based research aims at creating an in depth, multifaceted understanding of complex issues in the real world. For an example, if a marketing enterprise would like to open a mart in a given location, based on the opinion of the demography, the orientation of the mart will be decided on, or the elements of the mart will be oriented. So, same mart X in different location may have different orientation depending on the requirement of the demography. So this is a typical example of case study based research. Ethnography research. Ethnography research tries to look into people in their cultural background or cultural setting. The objective of ethnography research is to produce a narrative of a particular culture against the theoretical backdrop. Example, study of different tribes that are there in a given location. So this is an example of ethnographic research. Now let us move on to narrative research. Narrative research is a research wherein a researcher tries to interpret stories that are told within the context of the research, or stories that are shared in everyday life. For an example, historical research is an example of narrative research. Now let us move on to grounded theory research. Grounded theory research is concerned with generation of theories or patterns in data that are systematically collected and analyzed. So grounded theory research aims at generating patterns that are hidden in the data, patterns that can be used in order to provide solutions for research initiatives. So this kind of research is used in order to uncover or discover relationships and behaviors. Now let us move on to action research. Action research is a type of research which includes selecting focus points, clarifying theories, identifying research questions, collecting data, analyzing data, reporting results, and then taking informed action. So these are the steps that are involved in action research. Now let us move on to archival research. Archival research is a research that includes searching for facts in archives, which includes special collection libraries or repositories. So archival sources can be manuscripts, documents, audiovisual records, objects, or any material of interest. So depending on the requirement of the research initiative, you may adapt to either of these research strategies, including experimental research, survey research, case study based research, ethnographic research, narrative research, grounded theory research, action research, and archival research. Now let us move on to differences between quantitative and qualitative research. For ease of understanding, I have represented quantitative and qualitative research with regards to these attributes: definition, approach, data collection methodology, objective, common purpose, and direction. Let us start with quantitative research. Quantitative research is a research that includes or that involves numerical analysis of data which intends to generate certain quantified facts. In case of quantitative research, we use statistical approaches for calculating different data points. Examples are mean, median, and mode, standard deviation, correlation, so on and so forth. So these are the approaches that are adapted. So in case of quantitative research, we tend to statistically analyze data and represent the result in form of numeric data points expressed as different measures. In case of quantitative research, the data collection methodologies adapted are: we use a close-ended survey or close-ended questions. The questions are often structured. We use single choice question or multi-choice question or ranking questions depending on the requirement of the research initiative. So in case of quantitative research, we use completely structured approach for acquiring data. The very objective of quantitative research is to draw certain meaningful conclusions through large-scale study that is statistically conducted. The common purpose of quantitative research is to seek statistical answers to the research questions that can be measured and tested. The direction of quantitative research is to have a conclusive result based on certain frequency. Now let us move on to qualitative research. Qualitative research describes opinions or feelings that cannot be quantified or numerically represented. So here, in case of qualitative research, the approach adapted is rather complex, so we need to rely on manual analysis of the opinions in order to draw certain meaningful conclusions. In case of qualitative research, the data collection methodologies adapted are often open-ended in nature, or we use open-ended survey. The questions are often unstructured or semi-structured. We rely on focus group sessions or analysis of documents and contents. The objective of qualitative research is formulating hypotheses and gathering detailed information for smaller groups. The common purpose of qualitative research is to discover ideas with general research objectives. Here, the intention is to observe, interpret, and understand. In case of qualitative research, the direction is often exploratory, and here the question that is often asked is why. So these are the major differences between qualitative and quantitative research. So against these all attributes, you can explain quantitative and qualitative research. Now let us move on to cross-sectional and longitudinal research. Here I have explained cross-sectional and longitudinal research with the help of these attributes: analysis, approach, sample, organization, time and cost, and usage. Now, both cross-sectional and longitudinal research are observational study. But in case of longitudinal study or longitudinal research, here what we tend to do is we tend to repeatedly examine same subject to detect changes that may occur over a period of time. So in case of longitudinal study, we repeatedly examine the same subjects to detect changes that occurs over a period of time. Whereas in case of cross-sectional study, we tend to examine different subjects at specific point in time. This implies longitudinal study or longitudinal research is rather iterative, whereas cross-sectional research is rather elaborative and comprehensive. Right? So approach. So longitudinal study is an iterative but intensive approach, whereas cross-sectional study is simple but comprehensive in nature. In case of longitudinal study or longitudinal research, we examine the same sample, whereas in case of cross-sectional study, we examine different samples. In case of longitudinal study, we have group or individual as organization. In case of cross-sectional study or research, we have the entire population that's interrogated at a specific point in time. Depending on the nature of longitudinal study is expensive and time consuming, whereas cross-sectional study is comparatively lesser intensive and less expensive. Usage of longitudinal study is to determine cause and effect relationship, whereas the usage of cross-sectional study is to determine opinion or expressions. So, based on research philosophies, we can adhere to different research approach. The ontology may be different, axiology may be different, and research strategy may be different. For an example, here, in case of positivism, we may use a deductive research approach with an ontology being objective and axiology being value-free, and the research strategy may be quantitative in nature. In case of interpretivism, the research approach may be inductive, ontology may be subjective, axiology may be biased, and research strategy may be qualitative. In case of pragmatism, research approach may be deductive or inductive, ontology may be objective or subjective, axiology may be value-free or may be biased, research strategy may be qualitative and or quantitative. So in this class, what we have learned about is we have learned about different types of research philosophies. So there are 5 different types of research philosophies that may be adhered to. These are pragmatism, realism, positivism, postmodernism, and interpretivism. Then we moved on to differences between inductive and deductive research. Further, we discussed different types of research strategies that may be pursued, starting from experimental research to survey research to case study based research to ethnographic research to narrative research, followed by grounded research, action research, and archival research. Then we moved on to differences between qualitative and quantitative research, where we discuss quantitative and qualitative research, taking into account the attributes like definition, approach, data collection, objective, common purpose, and direction. Then we moved on to difference between cross-sectional research and longitudinal research, and eventually we concluded with the applicability of research approach, ontology, axiology, and research strategy depending on different types of research philosophies. Thank you very much. Have a very good day.